What if the oldest library on Earth wasn't built to record the present, but to preserve the past? What if humanity's first written words were not declarations of power or lists of grain, but desperate warnings carved by survivors who knew the world had already ended once before? In 1853, a British archaeologist working in the ruins of ancient Nineveh uncovered something that still troubles scholars today. Among thousands of clay tablets cataloguing trade routes and temple offerings, he found one that stood apart. Its surface was densely packed with cuneiform script, but the content made no sense within the timeline we'd been taught. It spoke of kings who ruled before the flood, of cities that existed when the gods still walked the earth, and of wisdom passed down from something older than memory itself. The tablet described 7 sages who emerged from the sea, bringing with them the arts of civilization, agriculture, astronomy, architecture, mathematics, not invented gradually over generations, but delivered whole, as though civilization itself were cargo being unloaded from a ship that had sailed through catastrophe. That tablet now rests behind glass in the British Museum, but its implications still ripple through everything we think we know about human history. Because if the Sumerians, our earliest literate civilization, believed they were merely remembering rather than beginning, then what came before? And more importantly, what did they know about the ending? Before we venture too deep into these ruins together, take a moment to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what hour you're keeping. I like to imagine this story unfolding across time zones, whispered into different darknesses, carried softly across the threshold of sleep. Whether you're in Tokyo at dawn or London at midnight, we're all tracing the same ancient mystery tonight. The story begins not with Sumer alone, but with a memory that refuses to die. Across every inhabited continent, separated by oceans and millennia, cultures remember the same catastrophe. A great flood that drowned the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes it. So does the Hebrew Bible, the Hindu Vedas, Greek mythology, Chinese legend, and the oral traditions of indigenous peoples from Australia to the Americas. The details shift, the names change, but the skeleton remains identical. Water rising, humanity nearly erased, a handful of survivors carrying fragments of the old world into the new. Coincidence doesn't stretch that far. Memory does. And Sumer, that narrow strip of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is where that memory was first pressed into clay and baked into permanence. Around 3200 BCE, in what is now southern Iraq, the Sumerians appeared in history not as primitives scratching out survival, but as architects of complexity. They built cities with geometric precision, mapped the heavens with stunning accuracy, and wrote in a language that has no ancestors, no parent tongue, no evolutionary trail leading backward into simpler forms. They arrived already fluent in civilization. Archaeologists expected to find evidence of gradual development, crude tools giving way to refined ones, simple structures evolving into monumental architecture, primitive symbols slowly becoming sophisticated writing. Instead, they found anomalies, mathematical systems that predate their supposed inventors by over 1,000 years, star charts matching modern observations, temples aligned to celestial events with engineering that seems impossible for people using copper tools and rope. And beneath it all, in the oldest layers of their oldest cities, inscriptions that whisper the same unsettling claim. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, not creation, not invention. Restoration. As though somewhere beneath the flood sediment and desert sand, buried under 5,000 years of forgetting, lies evidence of an earlier chapter. One the Sumerians themselves were trying desperately to preserve before time erased it completely. Tonight, we follow those whispers. We trace the clues left in temple foundations and star maps, in flood myths and impossible mathematics. We ask the question that archaeology prefers to avoid. What if the last generation before the deluge didn't simply vanish? What if they left messages for whoever came after, encoded in the very foundations of what we call the birth of civilization? The clay tablets are still speaking. We just have to learn how to listen. There is a moment in the archaeological record that refuses to make sense. A point in time where the darkness of prehistory suddenly ignites with the light of civilization. Not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of progress we've been taught to expect, but abruptly, as though someone had flipped a switch. That moment occurs in southern Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, around 4,500 BCE. It is the emergence of Sumer, and to this day, it remains one of the most profound mysteries in human history. Before Sumer, there were settlements, villages of mud, brick and thatch scattered along the riverbanks, hunter-gatherers transitioning to agriculture, small communities learning to domesticate grain and livestock. This is the pattern we expect, the narrative of incremental advancement. Stone tools giving way to copper, simple shelters evolving into permanent structures, oral tradition gradually becoming symbolic notation. Archaeology loves this story because it makes sense. It follows the logic of evolution, each generation building slightly upon the last. But Sumer does not follow this pattern. Sumer explodes. Within a span of a few centuries, perhaps less, the archaeological record shows the sudden appearance of monumental architecture, advanced irrigation systems, mathematical tablets, astronomical observatories, legal codes, complex theology, and most inexplicably, writing. Not primitive pictographs that would evolve over millennia into something more sophisticated. Fully functional writing. Cuneiform script capable of recording contracts, poetry, historical annals, and technical manuals with precision and nuance. It appears around 3,500 BCE at Uruk, already developed, already versatile, as though it had been transplanted from somewhere else, fully formed. Mainstream archaeology calls this the urban revolution, a term that sounds gradual but describes something that was anything but. The city of Uruk, the world's first true city, grew to a population of 40,000 to 80,000 people by 3000 BCE. It had massive temple complexes, including the White Temple and the Anu Ziggurat, structures that required advanced knowledge of engineering, geometry, and labor organization. These were not the fumbling attempts of a civilization learning to build. They were confident, precise, constructed with mathematical proportions that would not be seen again until classical Greece, 2.5 millennia later. And the mathematics, when archaeologists began translating Sumerian tablets, they discovered something unsettling. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, sexagesimal mathematics, the same system we still use today to measure time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This is not a natural choice. Most early cultures counted in base 10, using their fingers. Some used base 20, fingers and toes. But base 60 is extraordinary. It is mathematically elegant, divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Perfect for astronomy, navigation, and complex calculations. But why would the first civilization choose it? How did they even conceive of it? The answer offered by the Sumerians themselves is simple and strange. They didn't choose it. They were taught it. By the Anunnaki, by the Apkallu, by beings who came before the flood and established the principles upon which civilization would be built. To the Sumerians, their knowledge was not an achievement. It was an inheritance. This becomes even more perplexing when we examine the Sumerian king list, one of the most controversial documents in ancient history. Carved on clay tablets and stone prisms, the king list purports to be a chronological record of every ruler of Sumer from the beginning of kingship until the time of the scribes who recorded it. The list begins with a phrase that has echoed through the centuries, haunting every scholar who has tried to rationalize it. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not established, not invented, descended, as though rulership itself, the very concept of organized government, had come from above. And then the list does something that defies all logic. It names the pre-flood kings, 8 rulers, who reigned before the deluge, and assigns them reign lengths that are astronomically impossible. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. The numbers continue, vast and incomprehensible, until we reach the flood. After the deluge, the reigns suddenly become shorter, still exaggerated by modern standards, but within the realm of legendary exaggeration, rather than cosmic absurdity. Post-flood kings ruled for hundreds of years, then mere decades, eventually approaching lifespans that seem almost human. Scholars have struggled with this text for over a century. Some argue the numbers are symbolic, representing dynasties rather than individuals, or that the Sumerians used a different method of counting years. Others suggest the pre-flood kings were mythological figures, deified ancestors whose stories had been inflated beyond recognition. But the Sumerian scribes did not treat this list as mythology. They treated it as history, copying and preserving it with the same care they gave to tax records and legal contracts. The king list was maintained for over 1,000 years, updated by successive dynasties, each one adding their own rulers to the chain. It was not a creation myth, it was a chronicle, and here is what makes it truly unsettling. The list divides history into 2 eras, before the flood and after. Everything that came before was different, the rules were different. Time itself operated on a different scale, and then the flood came, and the world that followed was diminished, mortal, struggling to remember what had been lost. This is not unique to Sumer. When we compare the emergence of Sumerian civilization to other ancient cultures, the contrast is striking. Egypt, often seen as Sumer's contemporary, shows clear developmental stages. We can trace Egyptian culture from pre-dynastic villages to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, from simple pottery to the construction of the pyramids over centuries. There is progression, evolution, a visible archaeological trail. The Indus Valley civilization shows similar gradual development, as does early China. These cultures grew. Sumer appeared. Some archaeologists argue that we simply haven't found the earlier stages yet, that the evidence is buried deeper, lost to erosion, or submerged beneath the shifting courses of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Persian Gulf coastline has changed dramatically over the past 10,000 years. What is now shallow water was once dry land, and it is possible, even likely, that earlier settlements lie beneath the sea. But if that is true, why does every settlement we have found in Sumer already possess writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture? Why do we never find the transitional stages, the proto-cities where these systems were being developed? The alternative explanation, the one whispered in the margins of academic papers and explored in the tablets themselves, is that Sumer was founded by survivors, people who came from somewhere else, carrying with them the knowledge of a previous world. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation myths in existence, tells this story. It describes the founding of Eridu, the first city, not as a slow process of settlement, but as a deliberate act of re-establishment. The gods, it says, created humanity to tend the earth after the flood had destroyed what came before. They taught the survivors how to build, how to plant, how to govern, and then they withdrew, leaving humanity to carry forward the sacred work of preservation. This narrative appears again and again in Sumerian texts. The flood is not presented as an isolated event, a divine punishment tucked into a moral fable. It is presented as a historical boundary, the line between the old world and the new. Before the flood, there were cities whose names are remembered: Eridu, Batibera, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. These were the 5 cities of the antediluvian age, ruled by the ancient kings, inhabited by the Anunnaki and their human subjects. And then the waters came. The tablets describe it in language that is vivid, almost traumatic. The flood swept over the cult centers. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. Notice the phrasing. The kingship descended again, as though it had been there before, was taken away, and then returned. This is not the language of mythology. This is the language of restoration. Modern geology offers an uncomfortable echo of this ancient claim. Around 5000 to 6000 BCE, sea levels rose dramatically as the last ice age ended. The Persian Gulf basin, which had been dry land during the glacial period, flooded rapidly. Coastal settlements would have been submerged. River valleys would have become impassable torrents. If there had been communities living in these low-lying areas, and all evidence suggests there were, they would have been forced to migrate, to move to higher ground, to rebuild. What would those survivors have carried with them? Tools, seeds, livestock, and knowledge. The memory of how things were done before. The formulas, the star charts, the sacred rites, everything that could be saved from the drowned world. Perhaps that is what we are seeing in Sumer. Not the birth of civilization, but its resurrection. Not invention, but recovery. The sudden emergence of writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture would make sense if these were not being created for the first time, but rather being re-implemented, reconstructed from memory and fragments, adapted to new materials, new geography, new circumstances, clay instead of stone, reeds instead of wood. But the principles, the underlying knowledge, remained the same. And the Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this. Their language is filled with words for remembering, for preserving, for passing down. The scribes did not call themselves creators. They called themselves guardians. The temples were not houses of worship alone. They were libraries, archives, repositories of knowledge that must not be lost again. Every tablet pressed into clay was an act of defiance against forgetting, a way of anchoring memory into matter, so that even if the speakers died, even if the cities fell, the knowledge would endure. There is something both tragic and magnificent in this. The image of survivors, refugees from a drowned world, arriving in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the formulas in their minds. Gathering reeds and mud, the simplest materials imaginable, and pressing into them the most sophisticated knowledge humanity had ever possessed. Building cities, not as monuments to their own greatness, but as monuments to what they had lost, encoding into every brick, every inscription, every ritual, the desperate hope that this time it would not be forgotten. The sudden emergence of Sumer is not a mystery because we lack evidence. It is a mystery because the evidence we have points toward an explanation that challenges everything we believe about the nature of human progress. It suggests that history is not linear, that civilizations do not only rise, they also fall and rise again. And sometimes the rising is faster than the falling because the knowledge never completely dies. It sleeps, it waits. And when the waters recede, it returns. But before the gods withdrew, before the great flood reshaped the world, the Sumerian texts speak of others, intermediaries, teachers, beings who came before civilization itself, and who carried with them knowledge that would become the foundation of everything that followed. They were called the Apkallu, 7 sages, 7 wise ones, 7 who descended from the realm of the gods to walk among humanity in its infancy, not quite divine, not quite mortal, something between heaven and earth, existing in that liminal space where myths are born and memories crystallize into legend. The word Apkallu itself is revealing. It combines Ab, meaning water or sea, with Gal, meaning great, the great ones of the waters, the wise ones from the deep, and their descriptions, recorded across thousands of clay tablets, hymns and king lists, are stranger still. The Apkallu were said to be part human, part fish, covered in scales that gleamed like bronze, possessing heads within heads, one human face visible, another hidden beneath, as though their true nature could not be fully perceived by mortal eyes. They emerged from the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the world, the same sacred deep where Enki kept the me, the divine codes of existence. In some accounts, they rose from the Persian Gulf at dawn, walking ashore to teach the scattered tribes of early humanity. In others, they descended from the sky like falling stars, bringing fire and knowledge. The descriptions shift, the details blur, but the essential story remains constant. Before the flood, there were 7, and they brought civilization with them. The first and most famous was Adapa, sometimes called Uan, sometimes written as Oans in Greek transliterations. He was the prototype, the original sage, the one from whom all others learned. A Babylonian text from the library of Ashurbanipal describes him this way: Adapa, the sage, the first of the Apkallu, who from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun made firm the plans of the land. He taught the people how to build temples, how to organize cities, how to govern with law rather than chaos. He revealed the secrets of agriculture, when to plant, when to harvest, how to read the seasons by watching the stars. He showed them metallurgy, medicine, mathematics, not gradually, not through experimentation, but all at once, as though he were unpacking knowledge that already existed complete and waiting. But Adapa did something else, something more troubling to the gods. He broke the wing of the south wind. The myth says that while fishing in the Gulf, a storm arose, violent and sudden. The south wind overturned his boat, casting him into the churning waters. Enraged, Adapa spoke a word of power, a formula, and broke the wind's wing. For 7 days, the south wind did not blow. The climate shifted. The gods grew alarmed. How could a mortal, even a sage, even one touched by divine knowledge, wield such power? Anu, the sky god, summoned Adapa to heaven to answer for his actions, but Enki, protector of humanity and keeper of secrets, warned him, "When you stand before Anu, they will offer you the bread of death and the water of death. Do not eat, do not drink, refuse, and you will live." Adapa obeyed, but when he arrived in heaven, Anu did not offer him death. Instead, moved by Adapa's wisdom and humility, he offered him the bread of life and the water of life, immortality itself, the final gift that would have made him equal to the gods. And Adapa, following Enki's warning, refused. He turned away the one thing that could have elevated humanity beyond its mortal limits. He returned to earth, still wise, still powerful, but bound now by death. The opportunity was lost. Why did Enki deceive him? Was it mercy, ensuring that humanity would not bear the burden of eternal life? Or was it control, making certain that even the wisest among mortals would remain mortal, that the gap between gods and humans would never be bridged? The text does not say. It only records that Adapa returned and continued his work, teaching, organizing, preserving, until his death. And after him came the others. The 7 Apkallu were listed by name in later Babylonian texts, preserved by scholars who understood they were recording something ancient, something foundational. Uanduga, who completed the rites of purification. Enmeduga, to whom Anu gave the me of heaven and earth. Enmegalama, who was born in a house. Enmebuluga, who grew up in a pasture. Anenlilda, the conjurer of Eridu. Utuabzu, who ascended to heaven. And Utuabzu, who observed the omens and interpreted the will of the gods. Each one a specialist, each one bringing a different aspect of knowledge. Together, they formed a complete system, a curriculum for civilization. And according to the chronology embedded in Sumerian king lists, they did this work before the flood. In the antediluvian age, when the world was still young, when the cities were just beginning to rise from the mud, when humanity was still learning how to speak its own name. But then the flood came, the deluge that reshaped the earth, that drowned the world, that wiped away the first cities and forced the survivors to begin again. And after the waters receded, the Apkallu were gone, not entirely, but changed. The tablets say that after the flood, 4 more sages arose, but they were different. Part human, part Apkallu, hybrids. As though the original knowledge could no longer be transmitted pure, as though the connection between the divine and the mortal had been severed or diluted, and what remained were echoes, descendants, interpreters, rather than originators. This same pattern, this story of beings who come before, who teach, who vanish, appears across the ancient world with such consistency that dismissing it as coincidence becomes harder than accepting it as memory. In Babylonian accounts recorded centuries later, the Greek historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, preserved what the Chaldean priests told him about Oannes, the first sage. His description is vivid, almost uncomfortably detailed. There appeared from the Red Sea a creature endowed with reason, called Oannes. Its entire body was that of a fish, but beneath the head of the fish was another head, human, and at the tail, feet like those of a man. Its voice and language were articulate and human. During the day, this creature conversed with men, but took no food. It taught them writing, sciences, and arts of all kinds. It showed them how to construct cities and temples, to compile laws, and explained the principles of geometry. It made them distinguish the seeds of the earth and taught them to collect fruits. In short, it instructed them in everything that could tend to soften human life. Since that time, nothing material has been added by way of improvement. Nothing material has been added. The knowledge was complete. The foundation was laid. Everything after was maintenance, repetition, preservation. Berossus records that Oannes returned to the sea each night, living in the depths, neither fully of the land nor entirely of the water. An amphibious sage, a liminal being. And after him came others, more Apkallu, appearing periodically across the antediluvian generations until the flood erased them. In Hebrew tradition, the same pattern emerges under different names. The Watchers, angels sent to earth to observe humanity, who, instead, chose to descend and teach. The Book of Enoch, excluded from most biblical canons but preserved in Ethiopian Christianity, describes them in language eerily similar to the Apkallu. And Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. And he made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, and Sariel taught the course of the moon. Knowledge as transgression, teaching as rebellion. The same themes echo through both traditions. Beings from another realm bringing civilization, but also corruption, order, but also chaos, advancement, but also the knowledge of war, seduction, forbidden arts. And after them came the Nephilim, giants born from the union of Watchers, and human women, hybrids, just as the post-flood Apkallu were hybrids, beings caught between worlds. In Egypt, the same motif appears in Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and magic, who records the deeds of the dead and weighs the hearts of souls. In some traditions, Thoth was said to have lived before the dynasties, before the first pharaohs, in the time when gods walked openly among men. He taught writing, astronomy, mathematics, alchemy. He authored the 42 books of wisdom, sacred texts that contained all knowledge necessary for civilization and spiritual ascension. After the flood in Egyptian myth, after the waters of Nun receded, Thoth helped restore what had been lost. In India, the Rig Veda speaks of the Saptarishi, the 7 sages, seers who preserved the hymns and knowledge of the gods through ages of destruction. They are associated with the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, eternal, watching, guiding. Each one a keeper of specific wisdom, each one teaching humanity a different path. And they too are said to have existed across multiple cycles of creation, surviving cataclysms, reappearing when the world needed them most. In China, the tradition names Fu Xi, the sage king who taught humanity the 8 trigrams, the basis of the I Ching, who revealed fishing, trapping, domestication of animals, and the structure of the cosmos. He is depicted with a serpent's body and a human head, another hybrid, another liminal figure. He reigned, according to legend, before the Great Flood, before Yu the Great tamed the waters and founded the Xia dynasty. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, descends from the heavens to teach the Toltecs and Aztecs agriculture, calendar systems, architecture, astronomy. He is a bringer of maize, of writing, of law. He promises to return. And when the Spanish arrive, some believe tragically that Cortés is the prophesied return of the white-skinned, bearded god who once walked among them. The same structure repeats. beings neither fully human nor fully divine, knowledge brought from elsewhere, civilization delivered complete, a flood or cataclysm that interrupts the teaching, a departure, a withdrawal, a promise of return. And always, the memory preserved in myth, in king lists, in fragments of text that refuse to be dismissed as mere storytelling. Could these all be memories of the same event? Variations of the same original story, carried by survivors who scattered across the globe after the deluge, each group remembering in their own language, their own symbolism, their own cultural framework, but each preserving the essential truth that once, before the world ended, there were teachers, and they came from somewhere else. The archaeological record adds texture to the myth. In the ruins of Assyrian palaces at Nimrud and Nineveh, excavators found massive stone reliefs depicting the Apkallu. They stand at doorways, guardians, protectors, holding buckets and cones, performing rituals of purification. Some are shown with wings, others with fish cloaks draped over their human forms, the scales carved with obsessive detail. Their faces are bearded, solemn, ageless. They do not smile. They watch. These were not decorative. They were functional. The Apkallu protected the king, the temple, the city. They stood at thresholds, liminal spaces, where the sacred and profane intersected. To pass them was to cross into a sanctified realm. And the ritual objects they carry, the bucket and the cone, are believed to represent water and the spathe of a date palm, symbols of purification and fertility, tools for blessing the space, for maintaining the order established in the time before the flood. Cylinder seals from the early dynastic period show similar figures. Fish-cloaked sages standing before trees, temples, and celestial symbols. They gesture toward the heavens. They hold tablets. They point at stars. The imagery is consistent across centuries, as though the memory of the Apkallu was too important to alter, too sacred to reinterpret. They were what they were, and what they were was the link between the age of gods and the age of mortals. One seal, now housed in the British Museum, shows an Apkallu standing beside a stylized tree, often interpreted as the tree of life, reaching upward with one hand toward a winged disc, a symbol associated with divine kingship, cosmic order, and the heavens. On the other side of the tree stands a human king, smaller, subordinate. The message is clear. The king's authority flows through the Apkallu, through the ancient sages who connected earth to heaven. Without them, there is no legitimacy, no divine mandate, no civilization. So who were they? Mainstream scholarship interprets the Apkallu as mythological archetypes, symbolic representations of cultural heroes, legendary kings or priests, whose deeds were exaggerated over time until they became semi-divine. The fish imagery, scholars argue, could represent their association with Enki, god of the Abzu, the waters. Or it could symbolize wisdom, depth, the hidden knowledge that lies beneath the surface. But the texts resist such easy reduction. Because the Apkallu are not described like other mythological figures. They are not gods. They do not demand worship. They do not rule. They teach, and then they leave. They do not reproduce, do not establish dynasties, do not claim territory. They are transient, purposeful, specific. They appear, deliver knowledge, and withdraw, as though they were completing a mission. And the knowledge they bring is not spiritual or abstract. It is technical. Agriculture, astronomy, metallurgy, writing, law, engineering, the foundation of material civilization. Why would myths designed to explain natural forces or legitimize kingship focus so obsessively on practical, transmittable knowledge? Perhaps because the myths were not explanations. Perhaps they were records. If an advanced civilization existed before the flood, a culture that possessed technology, science, astronomy, and social organization, far beyond what followed, and if that civilization was destroyed by a cataclysm, then what would the survivors do? They would teach. They would find the scattered remnants of humanity, still living in small tribal groups, still hunting and gathering, and they would show them how to plant, how to build, how to organize, how to survive. They would appear as gods to people who had never seen bronze tools, written language, or celestial charts, and they would be remembered exactly as the tablets describe. Wise ones from before, teachers who came from the waters, from the ruins, from the drowned cities, carrying fragments of a lost world. The Apkallu in this reading are not myth. They are memory, cultural memory of the last generation before the flood, the ones who survived and chose to pass on what they knew, even knowing it would be distorted, mythologized, misunderstood, because the alternative was total erasure. Better to be remembered as fish gods than not remembered at all. And if that is true, then every depiction of an Apkallu in stone, every hymn sung in their honor, every ritual performed at the threshold where their images stood guard, was not worship. It was gratitude, a way of saying, we remember. We remember that you came. We remember that you taught us. We remember that without you, we would have remained in darkness. The 7 sages who came before, the Apkallu, the watchers, the bringers of forbidden knowledge. Whatever we call them, whoever they were, the evidence of their presence lingers, not in proof, but in pattern, not in certainty, but in the strange, undeniable consistency of stories told by cultures that should have had no contact, no shared tradition, no reason to invent the same myth independently. Unless it wasn't a myth, unless it was history. Fractured, mythologized, but history nonetheless. A memory of teachers who came from the world before the flood and gave humanity the tools to rebuild. And then, when their work was done, they withdrew into the waters, into the heavens, into the silence of legend, leaving behind only their images carved in stone and their knowledge pressed into clay. But knowledge is not only preserved in stories of sages and divine beings. Sometimes it hides in numbers, waiting in clay tablets stacked in forgotten temple libraries, inscribed with measurements that should not exist. Among the hymns and prayers, the king lists and grain receipts, archaeologists found something that stopped them cold. Star charts, planetary tables, astronomical calculations of such precision that modern scientists, armed with computers and centuries of accumulated data, had to check them multiple times before accepting they were real. The Sumerians knew things about the heavens that no early civilization should have known, not guessed, not approximated, knew with mathematical certainty. They tracked the movements of 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. This alone is remarkable, requiring dedicated observation over many years. But the tablets go further. They describe orbital periods, synodic cycles, and positional relationships with an accuracy that suggests not decades, but centuries of continuous astronomical record-keeping. Except the Sumerian civilization, as we understand it, emerged suddenly around 3,500 BCE, already possessing this knowledge. There was no learning curve, no progression from crude observations to refined measurements. The astronomy appears complete, as though copied from an older source. One tablet, discovered in the ruins of Nippur and catalogued as Vat, 4924, records the synodic cycle of Venus with perfect accuracy, 584 days. This is the precise time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun, a measurement that requires multi-generational observation, sophisticated mathematics, and instruments capable of tracking planetary motion with remarkable consistency through all seasons, all weather, across decades. The ancient Greeks would not accurately chart Venus for another 2 millennia. European astronomers wouldn't confirm the cycle until the Renaissance, armed with telescopes and the accumulated data of centuries. Yet here it was, pressed into clay by Sumerian scribes, precise and patient, as though they had simply copied it from records that stretched back far beyond their own civilization's beginnings. Other tablets track the orbits of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. They record lunar phases down to the hour. They predict solar and lunar eclipses with such accuracy that modern astronomers can verify them against computer models. And then there is the knowledge that shouldn't exist at all. References that some researchers interpret as awareness of planets beyond Saturn, celestial bodies invisible to the naked eye, worlds that humanity would not officially discover until the invention of the telescope in the 17th century. The controversial evidence centers on seal impressions and astronomical texts that appear to depict more than 5 planets. Some cylinder seals from Uruk and Ur show what looks like a sun surrounded by 11 spheres, a count that matches the number of planets and major moons in our solar system if you include Earth and exclude the Sun. Mainstream scholars dismiss this interpretation, arguing the spheres represent stars, divine symbols, or artistic convention. And yet the arrangement persists across multiple artifacts. Always the same count, always the same configuration, as though the Sumerians were preserving a diagram of something specific, something complete. Could they have known about Uranus and Neptune without telescopes? It seems impossible. But then, most of what the Sumerians knew seems impossible given their supposed technological context. Perhaps they were recording not their own observations, but inherited knowledge, star charts passed down from an earlier civilization that possessed instruments and methods we have not yet discovered in the archaeological record. And then there is the Nineveh constant. In the ruins of ancient Nineveh, among the library of Ashurbanipal, archaeologists found a tablet inscribed with the number 195,955,200,000,000, 15 digits, a number so large it serves no practical purpose in daily life, no use in agriculture or trade or timekeeping. For decades, scholars assumed it was a scribal error, a mistaken repetition, or a symbolic number with ritual significance. But in the 1950s, mathematician and historian Maurice Chatelain examined the figure and discovered something extraordinary. The Nineveh constant is a harmonic multiple. Divide it by virtually any significant astronomical cycle, and you get a whole number. The lunar year, the solar year, the synodic periods of all 5 visible planets, the cycles of eclipses, the precession of the equinoxes, even the orbital periods of distant planets unknown to the ancients. Every division resolves cleanly, without remainder, as though the number were designed as a master key, a universal converter for celestial mathematics. Chatelain called it a superconstant, a number that could only have been calculated by a civilization with access to extraordinarily precise astronomical data spanning thousands of years. Mainstream scholars remain skeptical, pointing out that large numbers can produce coincidental multiples, that pattern recognition can mislead. that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And yet no one has satisfactorily explained how or why such a number would appear in a cuneiform tablet, unless it served some astronomical purpose, unless it represented inherited knowledge from a much older tradition of skywatching. But the most inexplicable knowledge preserved in Sumerian texts is this: precession of the equinoxes. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, a geological timescale phenomenon caused by gravitational forces from the Sun and Moon acting on Earth's equatorial bulge. It takes 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. During this time, the position of the stars relative to Earth's axis shifts gradually, causing the constellations of the zodiac to drift backward through the calendar at a rate of roughly 1 degree every 72 years. To observe precession requires not one lifetime of watching the stars, but generations upon generations of meticulous record-keeping, data passed down across centuries, compared, analyzed, refined. The ancient Greeks suspected precession but couldn't confirm it. Hipparchus, working around 150 BCE, is credited with its discovery in Western astronomy, and even he struggled to gather enough data to prove it conclusively. Yet the Sumerians knew. Tablets from the old Babylonian period, successors to the Sumerians, contain calculations that account for precessional drift. They track the shifting positions of stars over centuries, adjusting calendars and star catalogues to reflect the slow rotation of the heavens. Some researchers argue this knowledge came from the Sumerians themselves, inherited through their astronomical traditions and preserved in temple schools long after Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language. How could a civilization that lasted in its purest form, perhaps 1,500 years, possess knowledge that requires 10,000 years of observation to acquire? Unless they didn't acquire it. Unless they inherited it. Unless the astronomy they recorded was not their own discovery, but a fragment of a much older system, salvaged from the ruins of a drowned world and carefully copied, generation after generation, so that it would not be lost again. The clearest evidence of this inherited astronomical system appears in a collection of tablets known as Mul.Apin, named after the opening words meaning the plough star, referring to the constellation we call Triangulum. These tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE, but containing material far older, represent one of the most comprehensive star catalogues of the ancient world. Mul.Apin lists over 60 constellations, organized by their rising and setting times throughout the year. It tracks the movement of the sun through the zodiac, records the helical risings of major stars, those moments when a star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn, and provides guidelines for using celestial events to regulate the calendar. The precision is stunning. The star positions match observational data from around 2300 BCE, centuries before the tablets were inscribed, suggesting the Sumerians were copying records, compiled during the height of their civilization, or even earlier. But the tablets go further. They describe the path of the moon through the zodiac, predict lunar eclipses using complex cycle calculations, and provide mathematical formulas for converting between solar and lunar calendars. One section outlines a system for tracking the synodic cycles of Venus, using a formula that produces accurate results over decades. Another describes the relationship between daylight and nighttime hours throughout the year, using ratios that demonstrate an understanding of Earth's axial tilt and seasonal variation. This is not the astronomy of farmers watching the sky to know when to plant. This is the astronomy of a scientific tradition, one that treats the heavens as a mathematical system predictable, and measurable, governed by laws that can be expressed in numbers. And the numbers themselves are extraordinary. The Sumerians used a base 60 mathematical system, sexagesimal notation, unlike the base 10 system most modern cultures use. 60 is a highly composite number, divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60, making it extraordinarily useful for calculations involving fractions and divisions. This is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds. Why circles contain 360 degrees 6 times 60. Why we measure angles and coordinates using a system inherited through Babylon, through Greece, through medieval Arab scholars, from Sumer. The choice of base 60 is not intuitive. Most human cultures naturally gravitate toward base 10, counting on fingers. Some use base 20, fingers and toes. Base 60 is abstract, optimized for mathematical efficiency rather than biological convenience. It suggests design, intention, as though the system were constructed by people who needed to perform complex calculations and chose the most elegant tool for the task. Tablets from the old Babylonian period show Sumerian mathematicians using base 60 to calculate square roots, solve quadratic equations, and determine exponential growth. One tablet, Plimpton 322, contains Pythagorean triples, sets of numbers that satisfy the equation a2 plus b2 warm c2, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The tablet wasn't teaching the concept, it was applying it, using it as a routine tool for geometric problem solving, land measurement, and architectural design. The knowledge was already embedded, already assumed, as though the scribes had inherited a system so refined they no longer needed to explain its origins. And then there is the calendar. The Sumerian calendar was lunisolar, synchronized to both the cycles of the moon and the sun, a notoriously difficult system to maintain because lunar months don't divide evenly into solar years. A lunar year is roughly 354 days. A solar year is approximately 365.25 days. To keep the two aligned requires adding intercalary months at irregular intervals, a process that demands precise astronomical observation and mathematical calculation. The Sumerians managed it flawlessly. Their calendar remained synchronized with the seasons for centuries, adjusted through a system of leap months that modern scholars are still trying to fully reconstruct. Temple records show that priests tracked the moon's phases, the sun's position, and the rising of key stars, using all three to regulate the ritual calendar and ensure festivals occurred at the correct astronomical moments. This level of precision is extraordinary for a civilization that supposedly invented timekeeping from scratch. Most early calendars drift chaotically, falling out of sync with the seasons within a few generations. The Sumerian calendar suggests deep astronomical knowledge, a clear understanding of celestial mechanics, and access to observational data spanning far longer than the civilization's known history. So the question forms itself slowly, unavoidably. How? How could the Sumerians possess knowledge that requires millennia of continuous observation when their civilization emerged suddenly, already complete? How could they calculate the synodic cycle of Venus, track precession, compile star catalogues, and design a sexagesimal mathematical system within a few centuries of settling in the river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates? Mainstream scholarship offers answers. They suggest the Sumerians were exceptionally gifted observers, that their priesthoods maintained rigorous astronomical records, that their mathematical system evolved naturally from administrative needs, And perhaps that's true. Perhaps human ingenuity, given the right circumstances, can produce extraordinary results very quickly. But there is another possibility, one that the Sumerians themselves seemed to believe. That the knowledge was not discovered, it was remembered. That somewhere before the flood, before the cities rose from the mud, there existed another civilization, one advanced enough to chart the heavens with precision, sophisticated enough to develop base 60 mathematics, organized enough to maintain observational records across centuries. And when the waters came, when that world drowned, a few survived. They carried with them fragments, pieces, shards of the old knowledge, star charts and formulas, and astronomical constants, inscribed perhaps on stones or metals, or simply memorized and passed down through oral tradition until writing could preserve them permanently. The Sumerians called these survivors the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came before the flood and taught humanity the sacred arts. Perhaps the astronomical knowledge in their tablets was part of that teaching, a gift from those who had once watched the stars from observatories we have not yet found. Calculated eclipses, using instruments buried beneath the silt, recorded the slow turning of the heavens across generations now lost to time. Or perhaps the knowledge came from somewhere else entirely. From visitors who understood the cosmos in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. From beings who taught the rhythms of the sky, the mathematics of celestial motion, the art of measuring eternity in clay. We may never know. But what the tablets make clear, what every star chart and planetary table and precessional calculation insists, is this. The astronomy of Sumer was not primitive. It was not the fumbling attempt of early sky watchers learning to name the stars. It was precise, systematic, inherited, a science preserved through catastrophe, copied from older records, maintained by scribes who understood they were not creating knowledge but safeguarding it, keeping it alive through ritual and repetition so that it would not be lost again. And when we measure time today, when we divide our hours into 60 minutes, when we calculate angles in degrees, when we track the planets and predict eclipses, we are still using their system, still counting in base 60, still following star charts that trace their lineage back through Babylon, through Akkad, through all the way to the wet clay tablets of Sumer, where someone long ago pressed numbers into mud and said, "This is what we saved. This is what the flood did not take." The stars turn, the numbers remain, and the question whispers across 5,000 years. Who taught you to see so clearly into the dark? Every civilization remembers the flood, not metaphorically, not as poetic symbol or moral parable, as event, as catastrophe, as the moment the old world ended and something new and diminished began. The Sumerians called it the Abzu rising. The Hebrews recorded it in Genesis. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion's deluge. The Hindus described Manu's flood. The Chinese remembered Gunyu taming the waters. The Aztecs told of the world destroyed by rain. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin preserve stories of a great rising, a drowning, a world beneath the waves. Over 200 cultures separated by oceans and millennia carry versions of the same story. Water rising, cities drowning, humanity nearly erased. A handful of survivors preserving what they could and rebuilding from fragments. Mainstream scholarship has long treated these as independent inventions, myths created separately to explain local flooding events, seasonal monsoons, river overflows, tsunamis. But the consistency is unsettling. Too many details align across too many cultures for comfortable dismissal. The warning from the gods, the construction of a vessel, the preservation of knowledge, animals, seeds, the landing on a mountain, the sacrifice after survival, the covenant between heaven and earth. How many times can the same story be independently invented before we have to consider that it might not be invention at all, that it might be memory? In 1929, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur, digging through layers of civilization, palace ruins, temple foundations, pottery shards, tools, seals, each stratum older than the last, each one revealing more about how the Sumerians lived. And then, at a depth of about 40 feet, he hit something unexpected. Clean clay, no artifacts, no pottery, no tools, no ash from fires, no bones, no occupation. Just 8 feet of pure alluvial sediment, river silt deposited by water, uniform and undisturbed, as though the site had been underwater for an extended period. And beneath that sterile layer, more artifacts, older settlements, earlier occupation, evidence of people living there before the flood layer, and then nothing, and then evidence of people living there again after. Woolley stood in that trench and understood what he was looking at. A flood, not a seasonal overflow, not a temporary inundation. A catastrophic deluge, powerful enough to wipe the site clean, to bury entire settlements under 8 feet of sediment, and to leave a geological scar in the earth that would remain visible for millennia. He famously declared, "We have found the flood, the biblical flood, the Sumerian deluge, the event recorded in the oldest stories humanity ever told." Other archaeologists found similar layers at Uruk, Kish, Shuruppak, and Lagash. Not identical in depth or timing, but present nonetheless. Evidence that catastrophic flooding had repeatedly struck the Mesopotamian plain, sometimes locally, sometimes regionally, leaving behind precisely the kind of destruction the ancient texts described. But there is a problem. The flood layers at different sites do not align chronologically. The sediment at Ur dates to roughly 4000 BCE. The layer at Kish dates closer to 2900 BCE. Shuruppak shows evidence of flooding around 2750 BCE. These are not the same event. They are separate disasters separated by centuries, each devastating, each catastrophic within its local context, but none of them universal. So which flood do the stories remember, or do they remember all of them? Could the Sumerian flood narrative be a composite memory, an amalgamation of multiple disasters compressed into a single archetypal event, the way trauma folds time, the way survivors speak of the war or the fire as though all suffering were one? Perhaps. But there is another possibility, a deeper, older, more global catastrophe that the Mesopotamian floods merely echoed. Something so vast that it could explain not just the Sumerian texts, but the flood myths of every continent. Between roughly 12,000 and 8,000 BCE, the Earth experienced the most dramatic climatic shift in recent geological history. The last ice age ended, not gradually, not smoothly, but in convulsive stages marked by rapid warming, collapsing ice sheets, and rising seas. At the height of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 BCE, sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than today. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern boundaries. What is now submerged continental shelf was dry land, fertile, temperate, and inhabited. The English Channel was a river valley. The Persian Gulf was a broad plain. The South China Sea was crossable on foot. Indonesia and Australia were connected by land bridges. And then the ice melted, not in a steady trickle, but in surges, catastrophic pulses of meltwater pouring from disintegrating glaciers into the oceans, raising sea levels in sudden jumps. Geologists call these meltwater pulse events. The most dramatic, Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 12,000 BCE and raised global sea levels by approximately 50 feet in less than 500 years. 50 feet. Imagine the coastlines vanishing. Imagine river valleys flooding. Imagine entire ecosystems, settlements, hunting grounds, sacred sites, everything built near water, swallowed in what to human perception would have seemed like a biblical rising. A flood that came not in 40 days, but across generations, relentless and inescapable. And then there is the Black Sea. In the 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed a hypothesis so dramatic it read like myth. Around 5,600 BCE, they argued, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, smaller and lower than today, isolated from the Mediterranean by a natural land dam at the Bosphorus Strait. Communities lived along its shores, fishing, farming, trading. And then the Mediterranean, swollen by millennia of glacial melt, breached the barrier. Salt water poured through the Bosphorus with a force estimated at 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. The lake became a sea. Its level rose hundreds of feet. Coastlines retreated miles inland. Entire settlements vanished beneath the waves in a matter of months, perhaps even weeks. Survivors would have fled, carrying with them not just possessions, but memories. Stories of the world that drowned, stories that would be told and retold, passed through generations, migrating south into Mesopotamia, west into Europe, east into Asia, carried by refugees who became the founders of new cultures. Underwater archaeologists exploring the Black Sea floor have found ancient shorelines, riverbeds, and what appear to be submerged structures, wooden posts, stone arrangements, all lying beneath hundreds of feet of water, preserved in the anoxic depths where decay cannot reach. The evidence is debated, interpreted cautiously, but it refuses to vanish. Something happened at the Black Sea, something consistent with catastrophic inundation. And it is not just the Black Sea. Across the world, archaeologists are discovering submerged sites. Off the coast of India near Gujarat, sonar mapping has revealed geometric formations beneath 120 feet of water, structures that suggest human construction, dated tentatively to 7,500 BCE or earlier. In the Mediterranean, the ruins of Atlit Yam off the coast of Israel sit submerged, a Neolithic village with stone houses, wells and a stone circle, flooded around 6,000 BCE when sea levels rose or the land subsided. In Japan, the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater formation of terraced stone, has sparked decades of debate. Natural geology or human construction. The symmetry, the right angles, the apparent stairways suggest intervention, but the dating, if human-made, pushes it back to 10,000 BCE or earlier, a time when no civilization is supposed to have possessed such architectural capacity. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar imaging has detected what appear to be megalithic structures at depths of over 2,000 feet, far deeper than post-Ice Age flooding alone could explain, suggesting either extraordinary antiquity or geological displacement. In the Persian Gulf, satellite imaging and seafloor surveys have identified ancient river channels, lagoons, and what may be settlement mounds, all submerged, all dating to the period when the Gulf was dry land, before the meltwaters arrived. Each discovery is treated cautiously, examined skeptically, and often dismissed. But together, they form a pattern. Coastal civilizations drowned, knowledge lost, survivors displaced. The Sumerians emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE, But southern Mesopotamia was precisely the kind of region that would have been most vulnerable to sea level rise. The Persian Gulf extended much further inland during earlier periods, and as waters rose, any settlements near the ancient coastline would have been inundated, their populations forced to migrate northward along the river valleys. Is it possible that the Sumerians were not the first civilization in the region, but the inheritors of an earlier, drowned culture? That their sudden appearance, fully formed with knowledge intact, was not miraculous but genealogical? That they carried with them the wisdom of flooded cities, star charts memorized, formulas preserved, stories retold around fires as they moved inland searching for high ground? The Sumerian king list speaks of kingship descending from heaven after the flood, as though civilization had been interrupted, not initiated, as though it had existed before and was being restored. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest known flood narrative, describes the god Enki warning Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, to build a boat and preserve the seed of mankind. Not just people, but knowledge. The text explicitly mentions the preservation of the me, those divine codes of civilization, as though the flood's true danger was not physical death, but cultural erasure, the loss of what had been learned. And then there are the flood myths themselves, catalogued by anthropologists, linguists, and historians. Over 200 distinct cultural traditions containing deluge narratives. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Genesis, the Greek Deucalion, the Hindu Matsya Purana, the Chinese story of Gunyu, the Zoroastrian Yima, the Norse Begelmir, the Inca Viracocha, the Mayan Popol Vuh, the Aboriginal Dreamtime floods, the Polynesian legends of Tauhaki, the West African Yoruba deluge, the Algonquin stories of Nana Bojo, on and on across every inhabited continent, separated by oceans, isolated for millennia, yet all remembering water, rising, drowning, reshaping the world. Scholars argue these are independent responses to local floods, psychological archetypes, symbolic representations of chaos and renewal. But the details, the specific repeating motifs, the consistency of sequence, betray something deeper. A shared origin point, a memory older than the cultures that carry it. Could the flood myths remember the end of the Ice Age, the catastrophic sea level rise that redrew the world's coastlines? It fits the timeline. The major meltwater pulses occurred between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE, precisely the period when human societies were transitioning from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturalists. Precisely the period when the first signs of advanced social organization, monumental architecture, and symbolic culture began appearing in places like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, a site so sophisticated, so inexplicably advanced, that it has rewritten our understanding of what pre-civilized humans were capable of. What if they were not pre-civilized? What if Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors, refugees from flooded coasts who carried knowledge inland and erected stone circles, not as the first stirrings of religion, but as memorials, as star maps, as encoded records of what had been lost? The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, carefully filled in as though its purpose had been served, or as though it needed to be hidden, preserved beneath the earth for future generations to find. The Sumerians built their civilization on river plains prone to flooding. They engineered canals, levees, irrigation systems, not just for agriculture but for survival. They were obsessed with water management, with controlling the rivers, with preventing disaster. Their myths are saturated with deluge, Their earliest cities were built on artificial mounds, raising temples and palaces above the floodline. This is not the behavior of a people inventing mythology. This is the behavior of a people remembering trauma, planning for its return, refusing to be caught unprepared again. The flood was not distant history to the Sumerians. It was foundational memory, the event that defined everything that came after, the reason they wrote things down, the reason they built in stone, the reason they preserved knowledge with such obsessive care, because they knew, they remembered how easily it could all be washed away. And perhaps that is the answer. Perhaps the flood myths are not myth at all, not symbolic, not allegorical, not invented, but remembered. Remembered imperfectly, distorted by time, layered with theology and meaning, but at their core, true. A memory of the world that drowned, a memory carried by survivors who rebuilt in the ruins and taught their children never to forget that the water came, that the cities fell, that the knowledge was nearly lost, and that only by writing it down, by carving it in stone, by embedding it in hymn and ritual, could it be saved from the next flood, the next catastrophe, the next great forgetting. The Sumerians did not invent civilization. They remembered it. And what they remembered was this: the world before was greater, the knowledge before was deeper, and the flood, however it came, whenever it came, took almost everything, but not quite everything. Not if the survivors wrote it down, not if the last generation before the deluge left clues in Sumer. Knowledge, the Sumerians believed, was not meant to be obvious. The sacred was hidden, layered, encoded in stone and clay for those who knew where to look. And perhaps that is why their temples were built the way they were, not as simple monuments to gods, but as structures that whispered secrets through geometry, alignment, and architectural repetition. Messages pressed into the very foundation of civilization itself. The most unsettling example stands at Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian memory, the city they called the first place, the dwelling of Enki, lord of the Abzu, keeper of wisdom, guardian of the me. When archaeologists began excavating the temple complex at Eridu in the 1940s, they expected to find a single structure, perhaps rebuilt once or twice over the centuries. What they found instead was something far stranger. 18 separate temple levels, each one built directly on top of the previous, stretching back through time like layers of sediment in the earth. A sequence of construction that spanned millennia. The temples grew larger as they ascended through time. The oldest, Temple 1, was small, simple, almost humble. A single room with an offering table and an altar. But even in that earliest iteration, the proportions were precise. The ratios of length to width, the angles of the walls, the placement of the altar, all of it followed geometric principles that would later define the great ziggurats of Ur and Babylon, as though whoever built that first temple was working from a blueprint, a template that had existed before the structure itself. And as the temples rose, layer upon layer, the design remained consistent. The same orientation, the same proportions, the same sacred geometry repeated with devotional precision across centuries. The 18th and final temple, the one that stood when Sumerian civilization was at its height, was enormous, a towering ziggurat visible for miles. But it was not a new design. It was an amplification, a magnification of the pattern that had been encoded in the very first foundation. The consistency is what troubles archaeologists. Cities evolve, cultures shift, architectural styles change with new dynasties, new priests, new ideas. But at Eridu, the the blueprint never changed. It was as though the builders were not designing temples, but reconstructing something from memory, preserving a form that had to be maintained precisely, or its meaning would be lost. And then there is the alignment. The temples at Eridu, like many Sumerian sacred structures, are oriented with remarkable accuracy to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, not approximately, not within a few degrees, precisely. This requires astronomical observation, careful measurement, and an understanding of Earth's axial tilt. The kind of knowledge that supposedly took civilizations thousands of years to develop. Yet it appears at Eridu in the earliest layers, already perfected, as though the first builders had simply known which way to point the stones. Other temples show even stranger alignments. The ziggurat at is positioned such that its corners align with the rising and setting points of certain stars during specific times of the year. Celestial markers that would have changed slowly over centuries due to precession. Did the builders understand precession? Were they accounting for it in their designs, encoding star maps into stone so that future generations could read the heavens by walking through sacred space? Some researchers have suggested that Sumerian temples were not merely places of worship, but repositories of encoded knowledge. That the dimensions, the angles, the proportions were themselves a language, a way of preserving mathematical and astronomical truths in physical form so they could survive even if the texts were lost, a kind of architectural memory. And buried in those layers at Eridu, archaeologists found something else. Clay tablets, older than most Sumerian records, fragments of inscriptions that reference the time before the flood. Not poetically, not mythologically, but matter-of-factly, as though the flood were simply a chronological marker, a dividing line in history. One tablet, badly damaged, records a king list that begins with the phrase, "After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven." Another mentions the Me of Eridu, describing them as ancient even in Sumerian times, knowledge that had been preserved from the drowned world, kept in the temple depths, waiting, the Me. That word again, divine powers, sacred decrees, codes of civilization. But what were they really? The Sumerian texts list over 100 Me, each one representing a different aspect of reality. Kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, music, metalwork, descent into the underworld, sexual intercourse, the art of love-making, the destruction of cities, law-giving, temple rites, craft of the smith, craft of the leatherworker, craft of the builder, craft of the scribe. They are abstract and concrete, moral and technical, cosmic and mundane. A strange mixture of categories that doesn't fit neatly into any modern taxonomy. Some scholars interpret the Me as metaphors, symbolic representations of cultural knowledge. Others see them as religious concepts, divine attributes that gods bestowed upon humanity. But there is a third reading, quieter, more unsettling. What if the Me were technologies? Not machines necessarily, but techniques, formulas, methods, the kind of practical, transmissible knowledge that allows a civilization to function. The code, in other words, not as divine decree, but as operational manual. Consider what happens in the myth of Inanna and Enki. Inanna travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into giving her the Me. She loads them onto her boat, the boat of heaven, and sails back to Uruk. Enki, realizing his mistake, sends servants to retrieve them. But Inanna escapes, and the Me are transferred from Eridu to Uruk, from one city to another. Knowledge is moved, not created, not destroyed, but relocated. This is not how myths usually work. Gods don't lose their divine powers through drunkenness. Goddesses don't steal metaphors and load them onto boats. But if the me were something physical, documents, tablets, objects imbued with technical knowledge, then the story makes perfect sense. It becomes a tale of espionage, of intellectual property theft, of one city gaining an advantage over another by acquiring its rival's knowledge base. And the texts are clear. The me were kept in the Abzu, the subterranean waters beneath Eridu, in the temple of Enki, a hidden place, a vault, a repository where the most sacred knowledge was stored, protected, preserved for those who would come after. This idea that knowledge must be hidden to be saved runs through Sumerian literature like an underground river. Enki is repeatedly described as the keeper of secrets, the one who hides wisdom in the depths so it cannot be lost or misused. In the Atrahasis epic, when the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, it is Enki who warns Atrahasis. But he does not speak directly. He whispers to the walls of a reed house, knowing Atrahasis is inside. A god conspiring to save forbidden knowledge through indirection, through code, through layers of meaning. And in the aftermath of the flood, the texts say that Enki revealed the me again, brought them up from the depths, restored them to humanity so civilization could be rebuilt, as though the flood had not destroyed knowledge, only hidden it temporarily beneath the waters. And when the waters receded, the knowledge returned, with the Sumerians describing a literal archive, a physical repository of pre-flood wisdom buried beneath Eridu, preserved in sealed chambers, waiting to be rediscovered. Some researchers believe this is exactly what they meant, that beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, there may still be vaults, libraries, storehouses of knowledge that predate the Sumerian civilization we know, relics of the world that drowned. No such vault has been found, but the search has not been exhaustive. Much of Eridu remains unexcavated, and the water table in southern Iraq has risen significantly since ancient times, making deep excavation difficult. The Abzu, the subterranean waters, are more literal now than they were 5,000 years ago. If something is buried there, it is buried deep. But the Sumerians left other clues, smaller, stranger, pressed into the cylinder seals that every scribe, merchant, and noble carried. These seals, small stone cylinders carved with intricate designs, were rolled across wet clay to create impressions, signatures, marks of ownership and authority. And yet many of them depict scenes that defy easy explanation. Some show the Anunnaki, the great gods, standing beside what appear to be celestial diagrams, spheres of different sizes arranged in orbits, radiating lines connecting them. Are these depictions of the solar system? Modern interpreters have claimed to see representations of planets, including outer planets that were not officially discovered until the 19th and 20th centuries. Uranus, Neptune, even a hypothetical ninth planet beyond Pluto. Critics dismiss this as pareidolia, seeing patterns where none exist. But the consistency is hard to ignore. The same spheres, the same arrangements, repeated across hundreds of seals from different periods and cities. Other seals depict winged figures, sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes hybrid, beings that do not correspond to any known species. They are shown holding objects, tools, instruments whose function is unclear. Some researchers see ritual items, symbolic wands or scepters. Others see something else. Devices, instruments, technologies rendered in stone by artists who did not fully understand what they were depicting, but copied them faithfully from older sources, because that was the sacred duty of the scribe to preserve, not to interpret. One seal from Uruk, dated to approximately 3200 BCE, shows a figure standing before a large structure that resembles a tower or a stepped platform. The figure holds what looks like a rod in one hand and a ring in the other, common symbols of divine authority in Sumerian iconography. But the structure behind the figure is strange. It is not a ziggurat, not a temple. It is geometrically precise, segmented, almost mechanical in its rendering. Some have suggested it represents a device, a machine, a technology that the Sumerians no longer possessed but still revered in image. Another seal, this one from the Akkadian period, shows two seated figures flanking a tree, often interpreted as the tree of life. But between them, rising from the base of the tree, is a double helix, two intertwined strands spiraling upward. Modern viewers immediately recognize the structure, DNA, the molecular code of life, discovered in 1953 by Watson and Crick. But this image was carved 4,000 years earlier. Coincidence? Symbolic representation of duality and growth, or an echo of knowledge that once understood the structure of life at a level we are only now rediscovering. We may be reading these images too literally, projecting modern knowledge onto ancient symbols. Or perhaps we are not reading them literally enough. Perhaps the Sumerians were showing us exactly what they meant, and we are the ones too distant in time to recognize it, because the texts themselves contain references that suggest the Sumerians knew their knowledge was incomplete, that they were custodians of fragments, not the whole. In a hymn to Nisaba, goddess of writing, the scribe prays, "May I learn the me of old, the words that were written before the flood. Not create, not invent, learn." As though the act of writing was an act of recovery, of piecing together a language that had been broken. Another text, a wisdom poem from the city of Nippur, includes this line, "The words of the ancestors are buried deep. Only the scribe who digs with his stylus may uncover them." The metaphor is explicit. Knowledge is buried. The scribe does not compose. He excavates. And then there is the Sumerian king list, that strange, troubling document that records the reigns of kings before and after the flood. The antediluvian kings, those who ruled before the deluge, are said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years. Impossible, surely. Symbolic, metaphorical, mythic. But what if the numbers represent something else? Not individual lifespans, but dynasties, or epochs, or cycles of time measured by a calendar we no longer understand. What if the Sumerians were recording real chronology, but in a numeric system so foreign to us that we dismiss it as fantasy? The post-flood kings, by contrast, have realistic reign lengths: 30 years, 45 years, human spans, as though something changed after the flood, as though the world itself operated under different rules before the waters came. And in the margins of some tablets, in the spaces between columns, scribes occasionally left notes, small inscriptions that were not part of the official text, but personal commentaries, asides. One such note, found on a damaged tablet from reads, "This I copied from a tablet broken by time. The original is lost, but the words remain." Another, "The old text was unclear. I have written what I could read. May the gods preserve the rest." These are not the words of inventors. They are the words of archivists, desperately trying to save something that is slipping away. Scribes who understood that they were the last link in a chain stretching back into darkness, and if they failed, the chain would break forever. Enki, the god of wisdom, was said to have established houses of knowledge in every city. Places where tablets were stored, copied, studied, and preserved. The ancient equivalent of libraries, but also something more. Temples of memory. Sanctuaries where the past could be accessed, interrogated, kept alive. And in those houses, the scribes worked in silence, copying text after text, year after year, generation after generation, not for glory, not for fame, but for continuity, for survival. Because the Sumerians understood something we are only beginning to remember. That civilization is fragile. That knowledge, once lost, may never return. That the flood, whether literal or metaphorical, is always waiting. And the only defense against oblivion is repetition, redundancy, preservation, writing the same truths over and over, in clay, in stone, in song, until they become too widespread to be erased. The me were not just knowledge. They were a system of knowledge preservation, a method for ensuring that even if cities fell, even if kings died, even if the waters rose again, the essential codes would survive. Scattered, fragmented, hidden in plain sight among the myths and hymns and legal documents, waiting for someone, someday, to recognize them for what they were. We are still searching, still excavating, still copying broken tablets and trying to make sense of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 5,000 years ago. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the dust settles and the pattern becomes clear, we glimpse something beneath the words. Not a story, not a myth, but a message from the last generation before the flood, encoded in geometry and grammar, in temple foundations and cylinder seals, in astronomical charts and king lists, and the strange, haunting consistency of a language with no ancestors. They are telling us they were not the first, that what we call the beginning was already a recovery, that the knowledge we admire, the science we credit to Sumerian genius, was not invented in the muddy plains of Mesopotamia. It was remembered, restored, rebuilt from ruins, and hidden, carefully, deliberately, in places where it might survive the next flood, in clay that does not decay, in stone that does not burn, in symbols that carry meaning even when context is lost, in stories that seem like fantasy but encode formulas, in temples aligned to stars that still shine, in seals pressed 1,000,000 times into clay, each impression a backup, a copy, a hedge against forgetting. The Sumerians were not writing for themselves, they were writing for us, for whoever would come after, whenever the waters finally receded and humanity tried once more to remember what it had been. And so the question, quiet and persistent, remains. What exactly did they hide? And have we found it yet? Or are we still digging, still translating, still decades or centuries away from recognizing the message that has been waiting, patient and silent, in the depths all along? So here we are, standing among the fragments. Clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks. Star charts that map the heavens with impossible precision. Flood stories carved into monuments before the ink had dried on any other written text. Mathematical formulas that appear already perfected. Bronze tools that show no evolutionary development. A language with no ancestors. 7 sages who came from the sea. And beneath it all, whispered through every inscription, every hymn, every king list, the same insistent claim: we were taught. We did not invent. We remembered. What do we do with all of this? How do we reconcile the orthodox timeline of human development, that slow climb from stone to bronze, from hunter-gatherers to urban planners, with the evidence that keeps surfacing in the ruins of Sumer. Evidence that suggests the climb was not gradual at all, but sudden. Not invented, but inherited. Not discovered, but recovered from something older. Mainstream scholarship has an explanation, and it is not without merit. Civilizations, they argue, develop in bursts. The agricultural revolution around 10,000 BCE created surplus food, which created population centers, which created specialization. Priests who didn't need to farm could watch the stars. Scribes who didn't need to hunt could keep records. Artisans who didn't need to gather could refine metallurgy. From this surplus came cities, and from cities came everything else. Writing, law, astronomy, architecture. The Sumerians were simply the first to put it all together in one place, at one time, in a way that left a lasting record. The sudden emergence, scholars say, is only sudden to us. We lack the earlier evidence because it was written on perishable materials, or spoken, or lost to erosion. The knowledge that seems too advanced is simply underappreciated. Ancient peoples were not primitive. They were observant, patient, and brilliant within the constraints of their technology. And much of this is true. The Sumerians were brilliant. They did observe with breathtaking patience. They did innovate. But the explanation, comprehensive as it sounds, does not cover everything. It does not explain why their astronomy required multi-generational observation, yet appears in the earliest texts with no prior tradition visible in the record. It does not explain why their mathematics show no progression from simple to complex, but arrive fully operational, already employing algorithms that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. It does not explain the consistency of the flood narratives, not just in Mesopotamia, but across oceans, across continents, among peoples who, according to conventional history, had no contact. And it does not explain the Apkallu, those 7 sages who came before the flood, who taught the arts of civilization, who are described not as humans, but as something else. Figures who appear in myth after myth, culture after culture, always with the same role. Teachers from another time, another place, or another world entirely. So let us consider an alternative, not as certainty, but as possibility, not as proof, but as a framework that accounts for what the orthodox timeline leaves unexplained. What if the Sumerians were not the first civilization? What if they were the second, or the 10th? What if, before the flood, there existed a culture, advanced and widespread, whose cities now lie beneath the risen seas or buried under millennia of sediment? A civilization that possessed knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and engineering. A civilization that mapped the stars, navigated by celestial reckoning, and built in stone and bronze. And then, catastrophe. Not metaphorical catastrophe, not gradual decline, but sudden, violent, and total. A flood, a comet impact, a crustal displacement, a pole shift, something that reshaped coastlines, drowned cities, and obliterated centuries of accumulated knowledge in a matter of weeks or days. Most of that civilization vanished, but not all. Some survived, perhaps in highland refugees, or on boats, or in caves where the waters could not reach. And when the world stabilized, when the rain stopped and the waters receded, these survivors emerged into a shattered landscape. The great cities were gone. The libraries, if they existed, were dissolved. The instruments, the star charts, the bronze foundries, all swallowed by the flood. But the survivors carried something more durable than artifacts. They carried memory. They carried skills. They carried fragments of the knowledge their ancestors had refined over generations. And they carried the desperate imperative to preserve it, to pass it on, so that what had been lost would not be lost entirely. These survivors did not settle in one place. They scattered. Some moved into the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the soil was rich and the rivers, though wild, could be tamed. Some travelled south along the Nile. Others crossed mountains into the Indus Valley. Still others sailed east or west, carrying their knowledge to shores we now call Peru, Mexico, China, and the Mediterranean. Each group adapted to its new environment. Each one mixed with the local populations, who had also survived, but in smaller numbers and with less knowledge. And each one became the teacher, the culture bringer, the bringer of fire and law and writing. To the people they taught, people who had lived through the same flood, but without the benefit of pre-flood learning, these survivors must have seemed miraculous. They knew things no one else knew. They could predict the movements of the stars. They could alloy metals. They could design irrigation systems and calculate land boundaries. They could write. And so, inevitably, they were remembered not as refugees, but as gods, or as sages, or as culture heroes sent by the gods, the Apkallu in Sumer, Thoth in Egypt, the 7 Rishis in India, Viracocha in the Andes, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, always 7, always coming from the water or the sky, always teaching the same things: writing, agriculture, astronomy, law, architecture. This would explain the sudden emergence. The Sumerians did not invent civilization from scratch. They inherited it from teachers who remembered an older world. It would explain the fragmentary nature of the knowledge. The survivors did not possess complete libraries or functioning workshops. They possessed memory, and memory is imperfect. It degrades, it simplifies, it mythologizes. What had once been a technological process, an engineering principle, a scientific observation, became over time a story, a ritual, a hymn to the gods. The technical details faded, but the outline remained, enough to rebuild if the conditions were right. And it would explain the global consistency. The flood myths are not independent inventions. They are retellings of the same event, preserved by scattered survivor populations who each carried the memory into their new homes. The astronomical knowledge is not parallel development. It is inherited from a common source, a pre-flood culture that had already mapped the heavens and whose descendants transmitted that knowledge in fragments to the civilizations that followed. The architectural similarities between Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, and pre-Columbian America are not coincidental. They reflect a shared origin, a common template carried by the survivors and adapted to local materials and needs. This is not a fringe idea invented yesterday. Scholars have noticed the parallels for centuries. Plato spoke of Atlantis, a great civilization destroyed by flood and earthquake, whose story came to him through Egyptian priests who claimed their records stretched back 9,000 years. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded Egyptian claims that their culture had been founded by gods or godlike beings in an impossibly distant past. Hindu texts describe cycles of creation and destruction, yugas that span tens of thousands of years, punctuated by cataclysms that erase entire civilizations. Indigenous traditions across the Americas speak of previous worlds, earlier humanities, destroyed by flood or fire, with only a handful of survivors preserved to begin again. Mainstream science, understandably, demands evidence, and the evidence for a pre-flood global civilization remains elusive. Not absent, but elusive. we have anomalies. The Piri-Reis map, drawn in 1513, which appears to show the coast of Antarctica as it would look without ice, based on older source maps now lost. The precision astronomy of the Sumerians. The aligned megaliths of Göbekli Tepe, dated to 9600 BCE, built by people who were not supposed to have the social organization or technical skill to quarry, transport, and erect multi-ton stones carved with intricate reliefs. The submerged structures off the coast of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean. Formations that some researchers argue are too regular, too geometric to be natural, but which have not yet been conclusively proven to be artificial. The ocean is the key. 70% of the Earth's surface is underwater. During the last ice age, sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. Coastlines extended miles beyond their current boundaries. River valleys that are now submerged were dry land, fertile and habitable, and coastlines are where civilizations thrive. They are where trade happens, where resources concentrate, where populations grow. If a pre-flood civilization existed, its greatest cities would have been built along coasts that are now deep underwater, accessible only to submersibles and sonar, invisible to traditional archaeology. As technology improves, as deep-sea mapping becomes more sophisticated, as underwater excavation becomes feasible, we may find what has been hidden, or we may not. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is it proof. The responsible position, the intellectually honest position, is to remain open, to acknowledge the anomalies, to recognize that the orthodox timeline, while supported by substantial evidence, does not answer every question, and to accept that history, especially deep history, is not a closed book. It is a palimpsest, written and rewritten, with older layers still waiting to be uncovered. What do we know for certain? We know that the Sumerians appeared suddenly with a fully developed civilization. We know they possessed astronomical knowledge that required centuries of observation, yet left no record of that observation. We know they built with precision, wrote with sophistication, and calculated with accuracy. We know they told stories of a great flood and of beings who came before, who taught them everything. We know similar stories appear around the world, and we know that approximately 11,600 years ago, at the end of the Younger Dryas period, the Earth experienced rapid warming, massive glacial melting, and a dramatic rise in sea levels, an event that would have submerged coastal regions globally and devastated any populations living there. These are the dots. The connections between them remain speculative, but they are not arbitrary. They follow a logical thread. Pre-flood civilization, cataclysm, survivors, transmission of knowledge, mythologization over time, rebuilding in isolation, parallel development based on shared origins. It is a framework that fits the evidence we have while remaining open to the evidence we might find. Consider Egypt. Conventional Egyptology dates the construction of the Great Pyramid to around 2560 BCE, attributing it to Pharaoh Khufu. And yet, no inscription within the pyramid itself names Khufu. The attribution comes from later sources, graffiti in relieving chambers of dubious authenticity, and assumptions based on the pyramid's position within the Giza complex. The precision of the construction, the alignment to true north within a fraction of a degree, the incorporation of mathematical constants like pi and phi, the massive scale, all of this has led some researchers to suggest that the pyramid is older than officially claimed. Much older. Perhaps built by a pre-dynastic culture and later claimed by the pharaohs, the way medieval churches were built atop pagan temples. The Sphinx shows water erosion patterns that some geologists argue could only have been caused by prolonged rainfall, which has not occurred in that region since before 5000 BCE, millennia before the Sphinx is officially dated. India. The Vedas, among the oldest religious texts in the world, describe flying machines called vimanas, cities destroyed by weapons that sound disturbingly like nuclear detonations, and astronomical observations that some scholars believe encode dates stretching back 10,000 years or more. The submerged city of Dwarka, mentioned in Hindu epics, has been partially located off the coast of Gujarat, with structures dated to 7,500 BCE. The Indus Valley Civilization, with its planned cities, advanced drainage systems, and undeciphered script, appears suddenly around 3,300 BCE, already sophisticated, with no clear precursor. The Americas. Tiwanaku, near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, shows stonework of astonishing precision. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together without mortar. Mainstream dating places its construction around 200 CE. But some researchers argue the site is far older, built by a pre-Incan culture whose knowledge was later inherited. The megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, with stones so perfectly fitted that a knife blade cannot slip between them, defy conventional explanations of Bronze Age construction techniques. Olmec heads, massive basalt sculptures weighing up to 40 tons, carved with features that some argue resemble African or Polynesian faces, transported from quarries miles away by people who supposedly had no knowledge of the wheel. Everywhere you look, if you look closely, the pattern repeats. Sudden emergence, advanced knowledge, flood myths, mysterious teachers, monumental construction, and beneath it all, the persistent sense that something came before. Something was lost. Something is being remembered. Does this prove a pre-flood global civilization? No, not yet. But it suggests that the story we have been told, the story of linear progress from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to enlightened, may be incomplete. History may not be a straight line. It may be a cycle. Civilizations rise, accumulate knowledge, grow complacent, and fall. And from the ruins, new civilizations rise, sometimes preserving fragments of what was lost, sometimes starting over entirely. The Sumerians, perhaps, were the first to write it down, to press into clay the memory of what had been, so that even if the knowledge faded, the record would remain. And that record, those thousands of tablets buried in the sands of Mesopotamia, are still speaking, still whispering across the millennia, still insisting, we did not begin this, we inherited it. We are the children of an older world. We are the keepers of a knowledge we did not create. We are the survivors of something vast and terrible and forgotten. Whether that older world was terrestrial or celestial, technological or mystical, drowned beneath the waves, or lost in some other catastrophe, we may never know with certainty. But the question remains, haunting and insistent. And as the oceans reveal their secrets, as new sites are excavated, as old assumptions are challenged, perhaps slowly, the answer will emerge from the depths. Until then, we listen, we investigate, we remain curious, and we remember that the absence of proof is not the proof of absence. The story of humanity is longer, stranger, and more mysterious than we have been taught. And Sumer, rising from the mud with knowledge already ancient, may have been trying to tell us that all along. And so we return to where we began, standing in the shadow of something immense, something that refuses to resolve into clarity. The Sumerians left us clues, not answers, fragments, not certainty, clay tablets pressed with astronomical calculations, that shouldn't exist. Stories of 7 sages who emerge from the sea, carrying the blueprints of civilization. A language with no ancestors, appearing fully formed and vanishing into liturgical silence. Temples aligned to stellar coordinates. Flood narratives that mirror accounts across every continent, and always, woven through everything, the suggestion that what we call the beginning was actually a restoration. That humanity did not invent civilization. We remembered it. The evidence sits in museums, catalogued and measured, translated and debated. VAT 4924, with its perfect tracking of Venus. Plimpton 322, with its Pythagorean triples a millennium before Pythagoras. The king lists recording reigns of impossible length. The Eridu Genesis, describing a deluge that swept away the world before. The Apkallu, those mysterious figures who taught the forgotten arts to survivors still clutching fragments of a drowned age. Each artifact authentic, each translation verified, and yet the picture they form remains just beyond our grasp. Like trying to reconstruct a shattered mirror from scattered shards, we can see pieces of the reflection, but never quite the whole face staring back. Mainstream scholarship offers explanations, mythology as metaphor, advanced knowledge as the product of centuries of observation we simply haven't found evidence for yet, the flood as localized catastrophe, amplified through oral tradition until it became cosmic in scale. These explanations are reasonable, grounded, careful, and perhaps they are correct. Perhaps the Sumerians were simply extraordinarily skilled observers, meticulous record keepers, fortunate inheritors of stable river valleys and clear skies. Perhaps their achievements, however remarkable, represent nothing more mysterious than human ingenuity applied across generations. But the questions linger, patient and unyielding. Why does their civilization appear with such sudden completeness? Why does their language stand alone, unconnected to any family tree? Why do their astronomical measurements require multi-generational observation periods that predate their supposed emergence? Why do flood stories, separated by oceans and millennia, describe the same cataclysm with such haunting consistency? And why did the Sumerians themselves insist, across thousands of years of record keeping, that they were not inventors but custodians? That knowledge had been given, not discovered. That the role of humanity was to preserve what had been entrusted, to carry forward the me, the divine codes, so they would not be lost again. We may never know the full truth. The flood, if it happened as the tablets describe, would have erased most evidence of what came before. Coastal settlements, river valleys, lowland civilizations, all drowned beneath rising waters, buried under millennia of sediment. What survived would be fragments, refugee knowledge carried by traumatized survivors to highland refuges, stories passed down through generations until they hardened into myth. Technical manuals copied and recopied until the original context faded, leaving only the formulas behind. But perhaps that uncertainty is itself the invitation. To keep searching, keep questioning, keep holding space for possibilities that lie just beyond the boundary of what we can prove. Because the archaeological record is not finished. 90% of Sumerian sites remain unexcavated. Entire libraries of tablets wait beneath the sand. And every few decades, something emerges that forces us to revise what we thought we knew, to push back the timeline, to acknowledge that the ancients knew more than we credited them with. The mystery continues. And that may be the most Sumerian truth of all. That knowledge is not a destination, but a process of recovery. that every answer reveals deeper questions, that the clay tablets, pressed in the reed beds of Uruk and Eridu, were never meant to provide closure, but to ensure we would keep asking. So if you're still listening, still wondering, still turning these strange pieces over in your mind, then perhaps you're participating in that ancient task, the sacred work of remembering. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're listening from. What mysteries call to you in the night? And if this journey through Sumerian shadows resonated with you, consider subscribing. There are more forgotten corners of history waiting to be explored, more whispers across the millennia. The tablets are silent now, but their questions remain. And in that silence, perhaps, something is still waiting to be heard.